I welcome one and all to this panel on this roundtable discussion on the rising and falling hegemonic shifts in the globalized era. We welcome you all to DASICON 2023. If this is your first panel here, we're glad to have you with us. Otherwise, it's good to see many familiar faces from the morning. I shall be your moderator, Anubhav Banerjee from MAIS 2. And of course, in this panel in particular, I feel like I am the upstart sapling in a forest of giant oak trees. So the way this is going to work is I will go down the list of speakers, I will briefly introduce them, who they are, why they're here, and then we will move on to each of their individual speeches, and then I will again interject and talk about how we had this question answer session to make sure it's convenient for everybody. With all that being said, it is my utmost pleasure to first welcome Professor Markus Kornprobst. Of course, he is our resident professor of international relations at the Vienna School of International Studies, as he prefers to have it named. Of course, he's a longtime faculty of the DA, has a wealth of experience in the domain of IR, and has been teaching in Ohio State University, Oxford University, and University College London. He is known for his many works of publications, including Co-Managing International Crises, a book I cannot recommend enough. Of course, I would also be remiss if I did not mention the support Professor Kornprobst has given us in the student body throughout and throughout for multiple academic and co-curricular activities. So we look forward to having your familiar but compelling points of view again with us today. The second speaker today is Professor Bajrektarevic, if I pronounce that correctly. Thank you. He is currently professor and chairperson at International Law and Global Political Studies, and a veritable doyen of international law and international relations. I, in the interest of brevity, will limit myself to only some of his long list of achievements, for he has a career spanning decades in the fields of IR and in the fields of academia, where he has been appointed as a pro bono expert for numerous institutions like the UNECE, the Council of Europe, the OSCE, concurrent to his many, many years as an academic. He is also the editor at Geopolitics, History, and International Relations, a New York-based journal, and has been elected as a mediator before numerous permanent international arbitration tribunals like the UNCLOS bodies, to say nothing of how he has worked in creating, for example, his platform, Modern Diplomacy, on politics, economy, and energy, and his numerous publication records in as many as 25 languages across 70 countries. Professor, it is an absolute honor to have you with us today. To my left now is Mr. Adnan Ćerimagić, if that's also correct.
Very good.
Thank you. He is a senior analyst at the European Stability Initiative for the Western Balkans and has had a long list of positions held at the same organization since 2011, if I remember correctly. And his background is in law from the University of Graz and in European Union International Relations and Diplomacy from the College of Europe. He's also worked as in the think tank and research departments as on the advisory board for the International Institute for Peace in Vienna, as well as the International Advisory Board at the Belgrade Center for Policy. We anticipate many of your perspectives from working in the field of applied theory. And finally, at the far end, but of course not the least, is Dr. Elisabeth Alber. Yeah? She's a senior researcher at the Comparative Federalism, at the Institute for Comparative Federalism, my apologies, at Eurac Research, heading the specific group Participation and Innovations, and works as a lecturer at the Social and Political Science Department in the University of Innsbruck. Of course, she is also quite prolific in her participation of promoting federalism through groups, through projects like the Let's Go Federal sort of plan that you've brought up that has been used as a template for many academic settings. And she has her specializations in comparative constitutional law, international relations, and is also a very valuable and very well anticipated member of this panel. Now that all the speakers have been brought to order, I can finally hand over the proceedings to the members of the panel, and I would invite Professor Kornprobst to begin his remarks on today's topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks a lot for introducing this panel. Very kind words. So we have each been given something like 5 minutes or 6 minutes on a topic that's quite large, right? So globalization, shifting hierarchies in the international order and everything. So I thought hard about how to convey my main points very quickly within 5 minutes. And I'm going to do that with the help of the sketchy sketch of world politics that you find there on the slide. Let me go through that very quickly. So when we talk about globalization, then yes, so some people write about globalization, some people write about deglobalization. But I think when it comes to the structure of international politics, there really is plenty of globalization. Yeah? And if we go through basically any kind of issue area that we're interested in, there is a lot of global interconnectedness. So economics. There are some indicators, you know, so foreign direct investment or something that at some stage has gone down a little bit. But overall, if we look at global trade, global finance patterns and everything, it's a very high degree of globalization. Security. If you take the issue of nuclear weapons, for instance, then obviously the world is highly interconnected. If something goes wrong in one part of the world, then the rest of the world is going to feel it very much. Environment, we hear about climate change a lot, all kinds of scientific pieces of evidence that all show us very clearly we really are one globe. Migration, highest number of migrants of all times, in various parts of the world, so definitely also very much a global phenomenon. Health, I think after the pandemic, one doesn't even have to make that point anymore. Before that, one always had to argue it. I think by now this basically has become a moot point. It's quite obvious. Yeah? So a virus doesn't need a visa or something like that. If we look about scientific, technological breakthroughs, then oftentimes also transboundary in terms of how technological breakthroughs are happening and what the repercussions are for the world. So there's very little denying of that. Yeah? So there is a lot of globalization. But the question is what one does with that. And there I want to distinguish now really in a very sketchy way and ideal typical way and very probably simplistic way, two different types of international agency that we find in our days. Yeah? The one is I label antagonistic national agency and the other one co-managing global agency. So very simply put, on the one hand, there are actors who think, okay, so we have all of this globalization, somehow we have to manage it. And somehow we have to manage it together. Vehicle for doing so is multilateralism, and if one looks at UN Summit of the Future and everything, preparations for that next year, there are all kinds of ideas to broaden participation. Multi-stakeholder dialogue is one of those terms for that. There is a lot of emphasis on the international rule of law. We see a lot of that happening at the General Assembly at the moment, and there's a lot of emphasis on adding to existing instruments that we have to regulate these flows of globalization. You can equate these actors sometimes with states, sometimes with certain political parties within states. So it's not necessarily that a state is this co-managing global agency all the way down. Yeah? So there are within states all kinds of contestations. So if we look at the United States, for instance, then over the last decade or so, it actually made quite a difference who was there in power and who wasn't. And now again, ideal typically, we can contrast that with what I label the antagonistic national agency. And there we have the acceleration of geopolitical competition. Yeah? And geopolitics, of course, is nothing new. Yeah? It's a term of the 19th century, and we can talk about this later on, where it comes from and everything. But there are different variations of that, and the kind of variation that we have now even includes territorial aggrandizement. So that is hyper geopolitics, at least in this one case. There is an acceleration of great power competition because there is one power that really tries to stay on the top, the US. There is one power that wants to go to the top, China, and there's one power that doesn't want to fall out of this exclusive circle of great powers, that's Russia. And then we could factor in other rising powers such as India and so on as well. And oftentimes this competition is accompanied and probably made possible if we look at domestic politics by rising nationalism. Yeah? So if we look over the last 10, 20 years, then democracies actually have been under pressure. So there's a rise of popular movements in Europe, in particular popular right, elsewhere also the populist left. And if we look at authoritarian systems, they oftentimes also emphasize nationalism, even hyper-nationalism, more so than they did even a few years ago. Russia is one of them. Just a few things about these lines, these black lines that I drew. There are lots of contradictions. Yeah, there's a very clear-cut contradiction on the one hand before the demands of globalization, the demands to regulate these globalizing flows on the one hand, and an agency that is particular inward-looking and very much in terms of zero-sum thinking, doesn't necessarily reach out and even thinks that compromises, concessions are a bad thing. Yeah? So oftentimes the term compromise has become a bad word. With a co-managing global agency, I think there would be something one could do, but even then would always lag behind these globalization processes to a very considerable extent. So much very, very briefly, my 5 minutes sketchy sketch of world politics, and I'm happy to elaborate upon it further later.
Never took you for a sketch artist, Professor, but here we are. Thank you for your talk. I now warmly invite Professor Analyst to speak.
Let me just switch on. Okay. Thanks. Guys, thanks for the invitation. Thanks for the beautiful show. It sounds like Eurosong. Warm greetings to Director of Academy who just joined us. So I better watch out what I talk. So I can just build up on the colleague that previously said. So when I'm invited to talk to peers, so then I usually come with the pre-prepared things, and I don't care, what they will think. But whenever I see the young people, I always have the same, dilemma, which I most probably will never solve. Do I have a right to throw my pessimism, which comes from experience, on them? Or I should respect this naivety in the eyes, and tell them some sort of encouraging stories. And I would never answer this dilemma, most probably. But what I feel, since really very altruistically I saw the emails, and everything, so it's a lot of altruism behind you. This chap is excellent, vote him for president, whatever entity comes up, he's excellent, So I'm sure that the rest of you, if you selected this one, that you also may be even better than him. So I'm just riding the metro, and I'm coming here and looking at your faces, and as a gypsy woman, so gypsy woman never has prepared story, so you think she sees something in the cards, but actually it's like, who knows where, she's tapping into the quantum field or whatever. So what bugs me for quite some time, since Corona time started, because we've been, all of us, alienated, through Corona. So pretty much left to me, myself, and I, all of us. Is there the triumph of the civilization which all of us identify with, and we usually refer as a collective West, as a collective, as a, a civilization, democracies, however you call it. And the question is actually, is there the moral triumph? So we had a lot of controversies which are now jumping out related to the so-called Corona event. The fair assessment would be to call it Corona event. We even don't know what is it. And actually, as time is passing, more and more we know less and less about, or less certainties are, as it appears. But definitely with the conflict that is taking place not too far away from here. And once upon a time, part of Ukraine was in Austria, so Austria directly participated in development. It's a civilizational circle, in a way. Also, both Russians and Ukrainians felt Vienna as, let's say, friendly territory, so that they came for shopping, for settlement, for skiing, for this and that, So it was rather close to each other. So the question is, so what will happen with us? Not with them, but what will happen with us? And it puts me back. So in 5 minutes I can just tease you. So this is all what I can do here. So there, I mean, money was not a prevailing factor in the course of history. If that was so, the Vietnamese would never win the war. The Napoleon would succeed. Nazism would succeed. Human rights would never have developed. We would still believe that. Actually, the cosmos is far away from heliocentric system and galaxies and other things. So we would be still in those myopias or in dogmas. So that means that actually this struggle of societal orders or the direction of the entire societies was the conduct that was taking us further, and that's very relevant because. You will get this world from us, and we screwed up so much, So when we turn to 90s, when I was actually sitting in those benches in early 90s, there was a lot of optimism, and we believed that by the end of the 90s we will end up in the self-realization of humankind, and we didn't. Look at us today, okay? So. The four normative orders, and that's a custom, which is very much compromised. Then comes moral ethics. Okay, and is there the moral triumph, and how to achieve this? And then, of course, comes religion. So we started actually getting to a scientific approach to religion, and dogmatic approach to science. And I mean, no wonder that we are having this misery of today. There is a lot of work behind. And then finally the legal orders, in which we see that actually legal norms are getting extensive. So I would just hint on you and maybe stop. So there was a serious attempt, which was not only political but also the pressure-wise, to negate one delegation to come to this country. To the forum, which in 1975 was the responsible for the overall relaxation of tensions in this country, on this continent. Because history of this continent is a history of small hysteric nations that we are fighting all the time. And the biggest achievement that we have ever made on this continent was the Helsinki Decalogue. When you go to Hofburg today, you will see that there are 3 basket organizations. And then very few people, old and boring like me, would explain you where is this fourth. The fourth was mutual recognition of borders. So if we violate the host agreement that this country was issuing and honoring the word, the legal word was giving, and negating delegation, that means that we are negating the very Helsinki spirit, and that has enormous consequences. And that paradoxically exactly plays into a card of those who want to change the borders. Are we so stupid? Are we so short-sighted? And also question of so-called aggressor state. I would invite you to check Articles 106 and 107 of the Charter of United Nations and to give a thorough legal examination of those articles in relation with 43. So what is the nature of reality? And how we elder are transforming this, or how we are informing you youngsters on this reality. So those are fundamental things, if we want to come from the moral considerations. And again, first and all question is there a moral triumph out of all of it? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ravis. Even though you say it was not scripted, you sort of very accurately explained this problem of this rapidly changing paradigms after the sort of disrespect of borders and how that sort of is a major sort of shift within the subspace of European politics, essentially.
You're so kind, I buy you coffee.
Thank you. Thank you so much. With that being said, now I invite Mr. Adnan to continue the discussion.
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for the invitations and for this very nice setting. So my introductory remark starts sometimes early March last year when we at European Stability Initiative think tank got an inquiry from a journalist from the other side of Atlantic. And he was wondering, he was puzzled by the statements by the EU High Representative for Foreign Policy and the NATO Secretary General from 26th and 28th of February, who came out and said this invasion of Ukraine is just the first step in Russian assault of the European security and political order. The next step will be Moldova and Western Balkans. And he was puzzled with it because he did not have any pre-knowledge about the Western Balkans, but what he could find on the internet about the Western Balkans was nothing that would imply that this part of Europe is in such danger from Russia, because first of all, 3 out of 6 countries that are in that region are members of the NATO. 2 other have NATO forces stationed on the territories of their countries, and all 6 have a perspective of joining the EU, and all 6 are at some stage of joining the EU. Their biggest trading partner was the EU, their biggest investor was the EU. So what is that Russia would have there to do? And geographically, if you see, the Western Balkans are surrounded by EU and NATO members. So how would Russia come into the region and create a mess for the region? So his naive questions, his reality holds much better and much thorough analysis of the situation in the region than many policymakers in the pre-February 2022 were willing to tell themselves or willing to admit. And the situation for us who followed the region for years was exactly that. There was a danger. The danger was that, yes, some of them were NATO members, some of them have NATO stationed there, but in the years following up to the invasion of Ukraine, in all of these countries, EU, European Union, as a global actor, as an actor, has completely either vanished or lost its credibility. The EU enlargement policy as such has, lost its influence in the region. We've seen flare-ups of conflicts between Kosovo and Serbia every 6 months. Every year, there's some kind of a security threat there. We've seen Russia being active in Montenegro, in North Macedonia in the past 5-ish or even 7 years. And in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the only news that comes from this country is about its dysfunctionality, it's about the threat of the secessionism, etc. So the EU de facto, at the moment of 24th of February, became vulnerable in the Western Balkans. And the policymakers like High Representative Borrell and the Secretary General Stoltenberg the difference between the pre-24th of February is that they were honest to say what the situation there was. And I would say, as a part of the introductory remarks, a couple of reasons why EU became, as an actor in this region, and in Ukraine, in Moldova, and partly in Georgia, such a weak actor. One is, I would call it the laziness of the EU. EU became an inward-looking actor. By the time of 2022, we didn't have a new single country joining the EU for 10 years. It's the longest period since 1973, when the UK, Denmark joined the EU, that the EU hasn't seen enlargement. In fact, at that point, the EU has seen one member state leaving the Union. There was no treaty change for 13 years. So EU didn't look into how it's functioning, how it's organized for 13 years at a treaty level, while in the 13 years before that, it has changed 3 times its treaty and updated itself for a new member. The second reason is that people or policymakers in the EU started telling themselves something which I would say they've started to pretend that, there was no war in Europe. When Ukraine happened, people kept saying, oh, the war returned to Europe, while in fact, Europe as such since 1990s was divided in 3 groups of countries. There was a core EU, which was already in 1990 enjoying the prosperity, enjoying the political, economic union. There was a group of countries that were given an opportunity to catch up and join this zone of prosperity and rule of law, etc. These are the Central and Eastern European countries, Croatia, Mediterranean countries, which then joined the EU. And then there was a third group of countries that were never given an honest chance to join this zone. And there we have seen wars since 1990s. If we talk about Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo, if we talk about Caucasus, if we talk about Moldova, if we talk about Ukraine, the Europe around the European Union is the Europe of instability, is the Europe of insecurity, and is the Europe that hasn't been allowed or given the chance. The second thing is that policymakers in the EU pretended that, especially after February 24, that Ukraine suddenly decided to join the EU or suddenly decided to join the NATO. And that's really not true. At many instances, both Ukraine but also Western Balkan countries really wanted to join the EU. They had reform governments. They wanted to join, but they were not given the honest chance to get there. And the third, and I think it's the most important, especially if we talk about the Western Balkans and if we talk about the challenge of Russia or challenge of China, which was mentioned in the region, is this pretending by the EU that the reason why these Western Balkan countries are not in the EU is because they don't reform. They can't reform themselves. We offer them support, we offer them all these opportunities, but their political leaders are not willing to reform and not willing to change. And that is simply not true. If you look back into the history of individual countries, you will see at instances very pro-EU, very pro-Western, very reform-oriented governments that simply were not given a chance to be part of a process that would help them reform themselves and join the EU in a way that the Central and Eastern European countries did that. And I always compare that with a medical student. It's a bit like telling someone who wants to be a doctor and finish medical studies that you don't have to be inside the university, inside the faculty. There is a library, there are YouTube videos, you can learn all of that and become a doctor even without being part of the studies. And while that in history was possible to some, today it's highly unlikely that anyone who's average will be able to learn without exams, without a feedback given by professor at the university to ever become and have a paper that says to have it. So EU, to conclude it, has, in the Western Balkans in particular, but also in Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, because of its hesitance, because of inward looking, has de facto, before 2022, given up on being an actor in its neighborhood. And while I'm hopeful that will change, and we're happy to discuss it later on, we still do not see concrete signs that has happened in the year that is behind us. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Adnan and for also reminding us why the exams we have in a few weeks' time are still important, because it is important again to remember that this is the inertia in Eastern Europe that has sort of resulted in some things about the hegemonic change which was already being discussed, and how that's led to sort of an expansion of Russian sympathy, at any rate, into sectors which previously really did not have as much representation. To round off the panel speakers, I would now invite Dr. Elisabeth to have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. When I got the invitation, I read Untangling Complexities, I said, okay, this is actually what we as a research group in the Comparative Federalism Institute do, because federalism, if you take it from a constitutional law or also political science perspective, and you look for a very simple definition, the simplest definition ever is basically self-rule and shared rule. So self-rule and shared rule somehow have to go together, and they have to be balanced. And so for those who are maybe more familiar with federalism, strictly speaking, you might wonder, okay, what does that have to do with international relations or with the question we tangle here now on this panel? And I would like to, in the few minutes basically, would like to say why actually federalism, broadly speaking, does matter. And we've heard it already in the beginning of the day, and throughout various panels I've heard that basically one issue is the concept of sovereignty. So is sovereignty, if you want to take it from a legal point of view, dividable or not? I mean, this is a question legal scholars can debate like for hours. We're not doing it here now. And there is an answer I personally like a lot, and that comes from the very other part of the world I had the chance also to do research in. It comes from a tiny island called New Caledonia. So I don't know, do I see faces about New Caledonia? Some not, some do not. Anyway, New Caledonia belongs to overseas France, okay? New Caledonia, and we can go into details obviously also later, in a nutshell, is an island that has gone through interesting processes because, first of all, it is linked to the international sphere, to colonialization, decolonization. Then, second of all, it has a very special power-sharing system, locally speaking. And third, it had a series of independence referendums. And all these issues like independence referendums, claims about sovereignty, who can decide what, is it my territory? Is a territory to be owned by somebody, or is a territory to be shared via policy making by more? And the answer basically in New Caledonia with regard to one of the leading figures who was unfortunately assassinated was that sovereignty is not about who actually has the last say. Sovereignty is about working out interdependencies. That is a very famous quote. And here we are back to the realm of international relations, to the question of the panel. If sovereignty is working out about interdependencies, and if, let's say, federalism, broadly speaking, including thus decentralization processes, coupled with democratization processes or decoupled with them, depending if you look to the global north or to the global south, then obviously it means also autonomy issues. It means some things I can do, some things we do together. We might have asymmetries, legally speaking, political asymmetries, geographical asymmetries exist. And so there, basically, kind of federalism, very broadly speaking, comes in. It's about managing complexities together across different levels of government, vertically, but also horizontally. And here, just to mention it, because it was not mentioned yet, we can remind us about the subsidiarity principle and about the holistic approach that was mentioned also in the panel on the pandemic. We need a holistic approach actually to redefine, let's say, dynamics within the changing global order, I would say. Obviously, there is still the question if it's the global order changing or if there is a change within the global order. I would rather go with the second sorts of scholarship. To round it up, basically, and we obviously can go into empirical examples, but just to give you some very, very summarized and simplified empirics. If you look into Latin American countries, we can remind us of what is going on and has been going on for more than a year, 1.5 years, when it comes to a pretty innovative practice on how actually in Chile there was the exercise by involving as many stakeholders and also citizens themselves in coming up with a new constitution that comes from a bottom up, with huge also reform attempts towards decentralization. Okay, this exercise then actually was shut down by the referendum, but that doesn't mean that it was not of great impact. We look into Bolivia, when you look into Ecuador, you see all this concept of plurinational, pluriculturalism, it's called there. Again, we can put labels as we want, but it means dealing with complexities. While if you look into Asia or Southeast Asia, you see obviously also there the questioning of the rule of law, the questioning whether or not which stance you take. I mean, there was the complexity to deal with the Kashmir case in India, just to mention one. There's the complexities to deal with decentralization issues in Indonesia, or also with very specific cases of Aceh and Papua. Again, just to mention some. And to round it up, not to be negative, obviously, but we can also see what happened in Myanmar in the window of opportunity, let's say from 2010 to 2021. The window of opportunity, to a certain extent, it's closed again because we have the coup, but it goes on under the surface. Again, talks are about decentralization, democratization, which then inform also, and that's my credo, basically the going of the international relations. They inform from below, you inform via constitutional reform, via politics that come from the peoples and from the politicians at different levels of government. Obviously, all this informs also the international order and the paradigm shifts.
Yeah, I would very strongly resonate with a lot of what you said. Often when we study IR, we look at states as these monolithic actors, whereas so many hot-button issues in the geopolitical sense, be it something more subdued in a sense like Kashmir, or something far more pervasive as, say, the Donbass region or the Rakhine conflict in Myanmar, these are all coming from the fact that even though we presume state actors to have this autonomy, it's in reality something very different. Well, I guess we've had 4 very insightful positions on different aspects of why we think there have been these massive changes in like the hegemonic orders that we see in this globalized era. And now we sort of open the Pandora's box and let the audience have their shot at all of the speakers here. And the way I want to structure this is I will take a feather out of Professor Kornprobst's modus operandi. We will take 3 questions. And then if you ask a question to a specific speaker, please introduce yourself and address the speaker. And if you want to pose a question to the panel generally, I would invite at least 2 members of the panel to volunteer to respond. And if anyone else wants to interject, you're more than free to do so. So do we have any questions from the audience? I mean, I can sort of use my moderator's privilege a little bit to sort of tie up, I think, something that's sort of a common trend. But yes.
Hello, my name is Camille. Yes, thank you very much for the very interesting inputs. And I would have a question to Mr. Ćerimagić on the Western Balkan question. There have been ideas of maybe reforming EU entrance, for example, in 4 stages, I think. Do you think that would be a good alternative to the situation we have now?
Thank you for that question. Are there any other questions before I sort of posit a general question to the panel? Okay.
Can I have just a follow-up question on the question of Camille too? Yeah, because we're having a project in Moldova currently. I mean, for the last 5 years, basically. So I'm wondering, what is your thought about Transnistria? And basically the relevance, I mean, it's a tiny stripe, but the relevance of, or non-relevance of, the realpolitik which is actually done there right now.
Thank you. And the question I will pose is a little bit more general. That's why I invite anyone in the panel to talk about, is why we sort of create this desire to work towards some sort of global order. What is the incentive to hold on to the existing unipolarity, multipolarity in the systems that we follow? How does this, why do we express concerns either at the rate of change or the degree of change if global orders are defined by state actors, essentially?
Thank you very much for the question. My issue, I mean, because the audience doesn't know the details probably of the 4 stages or of the accession, maybe just to say in the debate inside the EU of why they don't want new members to join the EU, the issue that popped up mostly by policymakers is that the EU of 27 is complicated enough, that the decisions are being taken very difficultly, and that without changing the procedures of how decisions are made inside the EU is simply not ready to have new member states joining. That's the dominant argument by those countries that do not want. So 10, 15 years ago, we had an issue of new labor coming, of different fears that countries had. At this moment, this is the major or the dominant argument. So for me, trying to find a solution for the stalemate in the EU enlargement process needs to address this issue. And where the 4 stages proposal fails is exactly there. It doesn't offer a solution for that, while at the same time presumes that the reasons why countries want to join the EU is because they will get more money and they will be able to sit inside the institutions. Well, that's not the case. That hasn't been ever the case. The reason why countries want to join the EU is because they want to be part of the EU single market, because the single market allows you 4 freedoms, it enables you to trade, it enables you to make your institutions fit, rule of law, oversight, monitoring institutions, etc. And that is one of the main reasons. If we talk about the political aspect of the EU, in fact, it has been developed since 1992 and forward. Everything that we had, what we know about the success of the EU has been developed before 1992, and in its essence, it's about the EU, a single market and 4 freedoms. So for me, if there is any improvement of the current methodology and current system, would be to do what the Austria, Finland, and some other countries did, and that is to join the EU single market first. There you don't have an issue with taking part in the institutions. You solve the problem or the fears that some EU member states, while at the same time you offer to these countries possibility to make their institutions fit, to adopt EU acquis, to adopt EU standards, and to show that they are capable to be part of this, something that is the biggest single market, that is the biggest market in the world, and you offer them support then for that. You offer for freedom. So if I would go with some adaptation of the current methodology, it would rather be that, presuming that governments will do reforms because they will get 100 million euros next year, and that then in 2 years we can say, but we will cut now these funds because they're not doing reforms again. That's simply, for me, it's too theoretical and it's too far from the practical terms. When it comes to Transnistria, I think that people neglect the success story of this SAA, Stabilization and Association Agreement with Moldova, which has actually enabled great part of economy in Transnistria to be integrated first in Moldovan economy and then with that in the European economy. If you see the tremendous shift from economy in Transnistria from Russia to the EU, the rules that then need to apply, the power that then Moldovan government has over this, you see a success story that has been, to great extent not seen by the outsider. So if we would employ this experience, and I always am for looking at what has worked, I think that if one would offer, even in these circumstances, and in particular in these circumstances, really something concrete to Moldova, concrete support on what the short-term issues is, like dealing with the budget, dealing with macroeconomic issues, but at the same time offering a concrete and achievable integration with the EU, I think that dealing with Transnistria would also be, to much extent, easier than it is at the moment.
Thank you. Do we have, we have a question there.
One additional question to Adrian, also on the issue of European enlargement on the Balkan. Suppose all the reforms are done, well done, and all the adoption of European law is done in all these applying countries. What do you think? Which of those countries have a real chance to become a net payer when they join the EU? The question is because if we have another enlargement with more or less net receivers, we have more or less anyhow to think about a completely new financial system of budgeting the EU as a whole, even the old EU, with the structure of EU financing now, you come to borders, and if we have another enlargement with the same structure of EU financing, with the 4 pillars we have, value-added tax and all the things, we all blow up the whole complete EU. So doesn't we need a parallel discussion in the whole EU about a new financial structure, apart from common debt and European bonds, whatever? Yeah? If you limit the discussion of budgeting only on European bonds, you will split a number of member countries like Germany, Austria, Holland, whatever. They will not take part in a debt budgeting of a future EU.
There was another question in the back.
Hello, my name is Markus Kornprobst, and I study economics in Vienna. And my question is to you, Dr. Alber. You mentioned power sharing in New Caledonia. Could you maybe go a bit more into detail about what it is, how it works, and also what maybe other places, other countries could learn from that? Thank you.
So I'm Victoria, I am MAIS 1 student, and my question is addressed to Professor Kornprobst. So you mentioned on your graph the antagonistic national agency as one of the points was, surging nationalism. So my question is, what are some of underlying factors contributing to the resurgence of nationalist movements in many parts of the world, and how this might trend might impact the balance of power and international cooperation in the coming years? Thank you.
Thank you. You've been on the line of firing for a while, but here's your next question.
I'll try to be quick. I think if we talk about the money issue, it's extremely important in the EU, because if we look at the history of the at least past 30 years, money was not an issue. I think someone mentioned that, but now it is, because if you go to Brussels and talk to the Commission about the money allocated for the Western Balkans, for Turkey, for Ukraine, they will tell you that they really struggle to find the money, because Ukraine obviously challenges now with energy and everything. They really struggle because they don't have money. So proposing to offer money in return for some kind of reforms in a staged accession shows how far it is from the reality. I think that the issue you raise is not only related to potential new members. It's also related to the EU itself. I mean, I live now in Berlin. If I go to the East Germany, I have a zillion questions about development aid and, you know, transfers of money and how they actually work. If you go to southern Italy, if you go to southern Spain, there are a zillion questions about how these funds are being used and what is the efficiency that they get. But if you look at the, for example, Western Balkans, it's 17 million people. It's the GDP it's GDP of Slovakia, half of Romania. The amounts of money they need to start catching up with the rest of the EU is not actually the amount of money that is, you know, a big bulk of what the EU spends. When we look at the EU in general, it's really a small portion of what would be needed. And as a maybe a last point, I think the Western Balkans have a huge issue of image. You know, European Union public looks at the Western Balkans as countries of a source of problems, countries that are unable to reform themselves, countries that are, etc., etc. But they are at the same time countries of huge opportunities. If we think about the changes that are happening now in the energy sector, if we think about the green agenda, talk to the experts on green agenda and potential of Western Balkans, which actually are not dependent on gas, which actually are not dependent on some of the they are dependent on the coal, of course, some of these countries, but if you talk about the transition, they actually are in probably one of the best situations at the moment in the continent to work on new energy and new energy sources. So if there would be a program, if there would be readiness to invest, actually these countries could be pioneers of something that could be, you know, energy transformations throughout the continent. But the political interest is not there, neither in the EU nor in the Western Balkan countries. And me and my think tank actually work on trying to get policymakers in the EU and in the region focus on also on these opportunities. Thanks.
Thank you. Dr. Alber, you may respond to your question.
Yes, thank you very much for the question. And I think, I mean, the elephant in the room is because I try to follow up on the money and then I come to the power sharing. The elephant in the room is geoeconomics as well. I mean, geoeconomics is pretty much, from what I know, a relatively recent niche within geopolitics, within the larger field of IR. And geoeconomics is the elephant in the room when we talk about how difficult it is to reform international organizations, how difficult it is to make reforms at national level that would then lead, I don't know, to the parameters of accession to, may it be the European Union, may it be any other association that requires criteria to basically accede. And geoeconomics then, in the end, apart from the realm of, obviously, international economic law, or let's say, if you look at maritime law, if you look at the sea law, you end up with economic exclusive zones, right? And here I come now to New Caledonia. So having, for example, obviously a lot of overseas territories, to see it from the European perspective, is a big advantage for different member states, because you do have, according to international sea law, economic exclusive zones that are very large, and that means also that you can exploit a lot of natural resources. So the elephant in the room is, again, geoeconomics with link to natural resources. We have been discussing natural resources at a certain stage. And very often in the conflict zones, which then are the theater of what we call changes or what we may call changes in the order or within the order, are often the conflict zones are often those zones that have still a lot of non-renewable natural resources, apart from the space, what we heard beforehand. But there is also a lot of still here on the Earth. And New Caledonia is such a case. I mean, it's one example, but it really exemplifies all this interconnection very well, because you had an autochthonous indigenous peoples, you have a colonial past, you have fights between basically the Europeans, the French people, generally speaking, the Europeans that colonized the island. Then you have the autochthonous population, they're called Kanak. And then there have been different decades. I'm not going into details, but I can give you the details afterwards. That there have been fights, civil unrest, and this civil unrest also revolves around basically the fact that New Caledonia has 25% of the overall worldwide nickel reserves. So you can obviously see that there is interest from all parts. And it is a tiny island, but it's interesting because it's in the Pacific. It's positioned just a couple of hours flight out of Sydney. And it is an area where Europe is present indirectly because France actually co-shares, let's say, New Caledonia. And they have special relations between Paris and New Caledonia. And within New Caledonia, you have special arrangements in the political system between the autochthonous population and the so-called settlers or French people and so on, so that you make sure that the interests of the Kanak people are represented. You have legal pluralism, you have an extra second chamber for them, you have different civil laws applying and all this. And the last comment on this is, in that part of the world, in the Pacific, you obviously also have a lot of interest coming from China. So China is very much interested in the mines that are situated, obviously, in New Caledonia. So we are back to our session, basically, to the larger geopolitical field.
Thank you. Professor Kornprobst, you may respond to your question as well.
Yeah, so Victoria, thanks a lot. So the rise of nationalism, there are basically two big arguments in the literature about it, yeah? And it's basically a feedback mechanism from globalization onto domestic politics. And one of them focuses on economics. So they're saying, okay, so overall free trade and everything that has led to more wealth. But within nations, this wealth becomes increasingly unequally distributed. So therefore, you have more of a division between the haves and the have-nots, and the have-nots then flock more easily towards nationalist ideas. And the other argument, and I think that provides a lot of the missing links there, is a new kind of political communication. So. And there is the social media are very important for that, yeah, and echo chambers and short-circuiting more traditionally, perhaps less biased media. And of course also because of artificial intelligence and all of that and wealth of data available, if you are running now a political campaign, then you can identify quite easily and in a lot of detail where the prejudgments of people are. So in the old days, public opinion poll, if they asked you, are you nationalistic? Yes, no, I'm overdoing it, yeah? Then they usually said no. If you ask, so if you follow more closely what kind of sites people look at and what kind of things that they read, then you actually get at these prejudgments of people, and out of those prejudgments of people, then you can make a big campaign, and that oftentimes leads towards more nationalism, because in all of those prejudgments of people, nationalism, of course, has never died out. Yeah.
Are there any other questions? I see one.
First of all, thank you to all the speakers for your insights. My name is Laura Mendoza, and I'm a student here at the Vienna School of International Studies. My question would be to Dr. Alber. You talked about the new trends in plurinationalism, multiculturalism, and constitutional reform in South American countries such as Chile or Ecuador. And my question would be, as we know, the whole region of Latin America faces a lot of challenges, including ethnic discrimination, and my question would be if you think that these reforms and these projects have the possibility of creating a spillover effect or being a catalyst for such constitutional reforms, bottom-up constitutional reforms in Central America as well.
Thank you. There's one more question there.
Hello, my name is Marion. My question relates to a similar topic, actually, that Laura touched upon. How do structures such as the European Political Community or also the Conference on the Future of Europe play into these hegemonic shifts, bottom-up approaches in our globalized world and the changes within? I mean, I know legally the EPC is not well defined, it's a very new project. But on the other hand, the Conference on the Future of Europe, the outcomes are aiming at treaty changes, which is a very legal fact. The institutions reacted with a lot of hesitancy towards those outcomes, but how do you assess this kind of involvement also towards the inclusion of the youth and citizens? Thank you.
To whom is this directed? Generally?
Generally, yes.
Okay. So I believe you had a pointed question. So,
yeah, thank you for the question. Of course, I mean, one would need more time to analyze the very different scenarios in Latin America. But I think the message, not to take time from the others, and we can go on afterwards in the break as well. The message is that what I would at least like to give is that there is a lot of so-called democratic innovations going on, and the challenge is basically to figure out how to include the non-state participation in decision-making. There is different models, and for sure in academia there is not yet enough also transfer of knowledge and let's say cooperation between everything what is happening actually in the Spanish-speaking and Portuguese-speaking world of the different countries you mentioned and in Europe. But we see in both in Europe, very interesting models of how you can institutionalize, so link basically the participation of stakeholders, of citizens, to decision-making processes. I mean, the Conference for the Future of Europe was mentioned with all its problems it had. There's also a very new model which is implemented in the German-speaking part of Belgium, which directly links a body of citizen assemblies regularly to the policy-making issue. And there is, and this is the last sentence, a lot to be learned between Latin America, Porto Alegre, and with the participatory budgeting and all these things that study there. And there's a lot to be learned when we actually exchange in academia, in the practical world, between politicians, whatever it is.
Would either of you take Marion's question on the role of?
No, I'm happy to say a few things about it. So if you look at my very sketchy sketch of the world, right? Then the European Union basically wouldn't know where it is there to some extent. Yeah. So traditionally, it's very much on the co-managing side. Yeah. And interconnectedness and everything, and of course, if one goes back, European security strategy, and even to some extent in the global strategy, as something different from the realist geopolitical world and everything. Yeah, and now it tries to basically come up yet again with the lowest common denominator, probably I would say between both worlds. Yeah, I mean the kind of old say, anti-realist and the more realist approach. So that's, I think, is always a problem with it. Where it very, very clearly is part of this co-managing global agency is in terms of trying to increase dialogue with people usually not sitting on the table. And that way, it's very much part of this multi-stakeholder approaches and all of that. Yeah.
Well, if we've no further questions, then I would like to thank the panelists for their time and their very kind words. I'm pretty sure we took a lot away from the session. I would like to inform the audience that we will now have a 30-minute coffee break where you can go get refreshments, and we will reconvene in this room at 4:30, where Ginevra will lead you into the next panel, and we hope to see you forward for the remaining sessions of DASICON 2023. Thank you.